Welcome everyone to this webinar. The webinar is organized by the Center for Autism and Theology based at the University of Aberdeen. Before I introduce today's theme and panel to you, let me very briefly introduce the center to you. The Center for Autism and Theology was launched in 2018 by Professor Grant McCaskill together with some other colleagues from the Department of Divinity and Religious Studies here at the University of Aberdeen. The Centre aims to host interdisciplinary research into autism in relation to theology, church, and faith. As such, we hope that the Centre can function as a hub that brings together all those interested in this intersection of autism and theology. And in this way, we hope to contribute to the academic world, but also to be of service to the church and other faith communities. As part of our activities, we organize 2 webinars per teaching term. And if you want to keep up to date with our activities and other things that we do and how you might get involved with the center, then visit our website, and of course you can follow us on social media. So today's webinar, I'm really excited about this one. It is titled Autistic Christians in Church Leadership. Perhaps it's useful to sketch a little bit of the background to this webinar. So over the past 1 or 2 years at the Center for Autism and Theology, we were getting several emails from people who identified as autistic and who were also in ministry or starting to train for ordained or specific lay ministry. They knew that being autistic would in some ways impact their ministry, but they weren't sure about how it impacted their work as ministers. And so they asked us at the center whether we had any resources or any support that we could help them with. And our answer, unfortunately, had to be no, we don't have that. However, what we did was we started to bring these people together in a small group to meet and share about their experiences, and in this way to support each other. In other words, as a center, we didn't have specific resources to support people in ministry, but we wanted to start the conversation because apparently there was a clear need. And today's webinar is very much part of that beginning conversation. So at this point, let me also invite everyone who's listening live to this webinar or watch later on YouTube to get in touch if you are interested in joining this group or finding out more about this group. So anyone who identifies as autistic and is in some form of ministry or training for some form of ministry, just get in touch with us by sending an email. Email address will appear later on the screen, but it is cats@abdn.ac.uk. So today then, we are very glad and grateful for the 4 people who agreed to share their experiences with us in today's webinar. These people are Sue Hartley, Chris Barber, Hannah Smart, and Ben Somervell. They will introduce themselves in a minute, and the panel and the discussion that will follow after the break will be moderated by Ian Lasch. Ian is a PhD student at Aberdeen and a priest in the Episcopal Church in the USA. And I will leave it to him to introduce himself in a minute too. Perhaps important to note at the outset is that this webinar is very much autistic-led in that all the panelists and the moderator identify as autistic. I'll leave it to Ian to give you an overview of what will happen today in the next hour and a half or so, and to introduce himself now. So Ian, over to you.
Thank you so much, Léon. As Léon said, my name is Ian Lasch. I am an autistic priest in the Episcopal Church, USA. I'm also a PhD student at the University of Aberdeen studying under Léon. And I was thrilled to be asked to be part of this, moderating this discussion and this panel, in part because I can't speak for other denominations, but in the Episcopal Church, our main means of clergy support is colleague groups. So we have a great many of those. And yet I found very early on that my experience as an autistic person was very different from my neurotypical colleagues. So hearing that this arose out of a colleague group that was designed around autistic clergy in particular and autistic church leaders in particular really interested me. Before I invite the panelists to introduce themselves, I just want to give a brief overview of the format that we will be following. I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves and then invite the next panelist to introduce themselves as well in succession. Those introductions will be brief, about a minute long. Following that, we will have longer presentations by the panelists where they'll talk about their experiences as autistic leaders in the church. After each panelist presents, we'll pause for a minute or so just to process before moving on to the next panelist. And then once all of the panelists have completed, I will announce a 5-minute break and give an introduction to the Q&A and the way that the Q&A will proceed. After the Q&A, we'll have a brief wrap-up by Léon before the event concludes. So with that, I will invite Sue to introduce herself. Sue.
Thank you very much, Ian. Hello, everyone. My name is Sue Hartley, and I'm a 72-year-old self-supporting Anglican priest in the Chelmsford diocese, that's Essex and East London. I was ordained 20 years ago after a career in general practice, but only diagnosed with autism 6 years ago, and I'll be talking a bit more about that a little bit later. I'm based in a local parish. I'm now permission to officiate, but do take regular services, but most of my ministry is in other areas. For example, I have a busy spiritual direction practice, and I'm also the dean of a network of people called to the single consecrated life in the Church of England. But one thing that's particularly exciting is that I'm getting increasing opportunities to lead workshops on autism for church leaders and spiritual directors, raising awareness and promoting good practice in pastoral care. And so I'm really thrilled to be with you today and to be part of this conversation, and thank you for your invitation. So I'm now going to invite Chris, if he would like to introduce himself. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Barber. I'm autistic and proud. I was diagnosed 14 years ago at the age of 49. I'm a registered nurse for learning disability by background. I'm also a PhD student working under Léon. And although I'm not in ordained ministry, I was a Franciscan novice in the 1980s, and I did train as a permanent deacon 20 years ago. I was never ordained. I left before the course finished. So I will now hand you over to Hannah.
Hello, my name is Hannah, and for those of you with an eye for detail, you might have noticed that unlike some of the other panelists, I'm not currently serving in a leadership role for Christian ministry. I have previously served as a leader in children's ministry, youth leadership, and latterly as a teaching pastor within Pentecostal churches. I'm a practicing psychotherapist and a community care worker by profession, and I'm really glad to be here today with the opportunity to share on a topic that I feel so passionate about. I strongly believe in the importance of diversity within the body of Christ, and that diverse leadership is essential for neurodivergent church members to move into the purposes God has for them. Having the insights and strengths of autistic Christian leaders, I believe, brings us a step closer to a ministry which embodies the scriptural foundation that we're all fearfully and wonderfully made, and therefore it's incredibly important to me that we have these spaces to think about potential barriers to Christian leadership for autistic people and how we collectively can facilitate the empowerment of autistic leaders within our church. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm going to hand you over to Ben to introduce himself.
Hello. Hi, my name is Ben Somervell, and I'm from Ormskirk in West Lancashire in the northwest of England. I'm training for ordained ministry in the Church of England at Ridley Hall in Cambridge, and before that I studied theology and religion at Durham University. When I was at Durham, I did my dissertation on autism and theology because I was diagnosed with autism 5 years ago now when I was aged 19. So that's where my kind of interest began. And yeah, I've been thinking about it and studying it for ever since then, really. And yeah, very glad to be here. Very interested to hear what others have to say. Thanks.
Thank you all so much. And once again, I'm thrilled to have you all here and look forward to hearing your experiences. So that means we will move to the next phase, in which we'll hear from each of you about your experience and your experience as autistic leaders in the church. So once again, we'll follow the same order. Sue, go ahead.
Thank you. So, given such a late diagnosis, what led me to seek an assessment at the ripe old age of 67? After my curacy, I was appointed associate priest to a parish, and the first few years went really well. Then the vicar moved on. I enjoyed the challenge of an interregnum, and then a new vicar was appointed with a very different leadership style to his predecessor. And then about just over 6 years ago, I saw a TV documentary on what was then known as Asperger's syndrome, and it described me perfectly. And I'd never thought about this before, but I did nothing at the time. But a few months later, there were some growing tensions with the vicar, and times I felt very misunderstood and had no idea why. So I decided to go for an assessment. But in those early days, I didn't know enough to realise that the things he was finding difficult in me were actually autistic needs, just needing accommodations. For example, he couldn't understand why it took me so long to prepare a sermon, because I researched the topic in so much detail and find it hard to decide what to include and what to leave out. I over-prepare, but the end result is usually well received. So I need to start preparing things well in advance. And then also my rigidity of thought meant I struggled with change and new ideas, which was sometimes interpreted as undermining leadership, which of course was never the intention. So diagnosis at my late age has been really important to me in increasing self-understanding, finding a career path that suits my profile, and the insights I've gained together with the wisdom from past life experience are really being used by God in the service of others, and I'm really excited about that. And so the advantage of being self-supporting means I can develop ministries that play to my strengths, like spiritual direction and teaching roles and that sort of thing. And so I thrive in one-to-one work that's paced and structured with a clear beginning and end, like spiritual direction. But I struggle with evening meetings where I get exhausted, unstructured social times, situations of change and uncertainty, and working in some group situations. And so, what accommodations would I find helpful? So, firstly, it's important my concerns are listened to and taken seriously, even if they might seem trivial to someone else. Given plenty of time to prepare things. One thing for spiritual direction I find helpful is having individual rather than group supervision. And as I struggle with uncertainty, needing as much information in advance about things as possible. And of course, need for sufficient downtime. And so I'm finding that I do need to share these with significant others in order to help me function at my best. But not only to share my challenges, but also my strengths, my commitment to see tasks through, my focus, my attention to detail, to name but a few. And so my faith and ministry give me tremendous purpose. My sense of well-being and belonging is enhanced through ministry rather than social encounters. I'm learning to recognise and accept my limitations and embrace a way of life more in sync with my autism, to live and serve within my limits. I'm learning to do only what I can cope with rather than what others expect me to do, and to say no to anything that could potentially lead to overload, despite others thinking I should be able to handle it. One thing I found quite exciting is that in my spiritual direction work, I'm actually Ignatian trained, and I'm actually finding a lot of connections between Ignatian spirituality and autism. And, Ignatius would say that God is at work in everything, and I believe that God is at work in autistic experience especially. And so he would say that if God has allowed me to be born autistic, he would invite me to trust that by his grace, this is the state in life through which I can know God better and make a return of his love more readily as I offer myself to him in my unique blend of weaknesses and strengths. And so God uses me as I am. Because of my uniqueness, I believe I can make a difference in ways that no one else can. I'm learning to accept my weaknesses and see them as an opportunity for God's grace and strength. And sometimes I'm finding that the insights I've gained into my areas of struggle have equipped me to help others who face similar challenges. And that is a really important point. And so I see my autism as an integral part of my identity and priesthood, part of who I am in Christ, not to be ashamed of, but to be welcomed, affirmed and celebrated. Wholeness is about being who I am, not what others feel I should be. It's about being honest with God, myself and others. It's about embracing those parts of me that are different and integrating them into the whole. But I still find it hard to ask for adjustments. There's a tension between suffering in silence or acknowledging my autism, which by doing so highlights my difference. But at the same time, I really want to raise awareness and change attitudes, so I usually take the risk. And just as I close, I'm encouraged by the teachings of the Apostle Paul, where he writes that we are all one in Christ, male, female, Jew, Gentile, neurodiverse and neurotypical as well, I think we would add. And then his teaching on the body of Christ, where he says that those who appear weaker are indispensable. And so for me, the last few years has been about finding my place in the body, recognising and using my gifts, and finding how useful my lived experience is in ministry to others. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. And just as a reminder, here as after each panelist, will pause just a minute to process before moving on to our next panelist. Chris, if you want to go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Best place for me to start, I think, was 37 years ago. I was a Franciscan novice. I'm Roman Catholic, and I joined the Franciscan order. I became a novice. This was years before I became aware of autism, and decades before I was diagnosed. But when I left the Franciscan order, a Franciscan priest who was a bit out there, should we say, he said to me, "Go and follow your instincts." So I did. I became a nurse, trained learning disability nurse in the late 80s. I became a Eucharistic minister within the Catholic Church, and I still serve as that. Became a reader, got married, had a kid. 21 years ago, I decided to re-enter the church, and I applied to become a permanent deacon within the Catholic Church. I was accepted. So I did 2 years out of the 3-year training course. I left before I was ordained. And one of my lecturers said to me that I can fulfill my diaconal ministry as an informal carer. My wife at the time had multiple health and disability issues. I eventually became her full-time carer. She died nearly 2 years ago. Around 10 years ago, I wrote a paper around disability and autism, particularly in terms of diaconal ministry. And I still see myself as a deacon with a lowercase d, as opposed to somebody who's ordained as deacon. And my diaconal ministry, for want of a better term, is around disability issues, autism, nursing. I took part in the Autistic strike today at my local hospital, and very much involved in disability issues within the church. What I'm finding is that I'm knocking on a closed door. Within the Catholic Church, disability issues is not a very high agenda issue. Never has been. And I take my hat off to those within the Anglican Church, within the Church of England, who are light years ahead of the Catholic Church in terms of disability issues, disability inclusion. And that's where my PhD comes in. I'm currently focusing on the experiences of ordained clergy within the Anglican and Catholic churches who have disabilities. How does my autism affect my personal faith? Good question. At the moment, there is no answer to that. I'm struggling to find a path that I can call my own. I'm drawn to contemplative prayer, contemplative lifestyle, and one of my fellow postgraduate students has likened me to a monk. She calls me a monk, which is very sweet. But I'm still struggling to find my own path as an autistic Catholic. Within leadership, still very much the idea of servant leadership. I'm here to serve. And by that, I don't mean I'm here to be seen to be serving. There's a subtle difference between serving and being seen to be serving. And leadership is very much a major aspect of service. And you can be a lay leader, in my case, a Eucharistic minister within the Catholic Church, a reader, or somebody who does praise for others. But that's leadership. And it can be an autistic leadership. very much a leadership of service. That's where I am at the moment, trying to discern a path that is mine that incorporates leadership, service, and contemplative prayer, all wrapped up within an autistic framework.
Thank you, Chris. So we will once again pause for just a minute before moving on to our next panelist. And now we will hear from Hannah. Hannah?
So, in common with Susan and Chris, I have been Christian longer than I've known I was neurodivergent. Like a lot of neurodivergent women, my path to correct diagnosis wasn't exactly smooth. Having been in the mental health system since my teens, the likelihood of being autistic was only even suggested when I was 30. I've recently also been diagnosed with ADHD. And I share this because I think it's important to consider the journey that autistic Christian leaders may have been on before the question of whether to disclose a diagnosis or not even arises. Our relational experiences, possibly incorrect labels, and what we've learned to mask in order to survive and function in a neurotypical world will vary for each individual. I've always been called to the pastoral care and teaching aspects of leadership and ministry. My heart is to see Christians live in freedom and move into the purposes God has for them. And very often, when it comes to difference, I've found the church itself, however inadvertently, creates some significant barriers. This includes sensory challenges presented by how we do church, the social aspects of connecting with other Christians and Christian leaders, and even at the point of simply validating autistic experience. I've lost count of the number of times I've explained to well-meaning brothers and sisters that autistic people do not lack empathy, and that the fact that they would never know I was autistic is more about my ability to mask and certainly not a compliment. The likelihood of autistic Christian leaders having other comorbid conditions, I think, is also worth bearing in mind. One of many reasons that universalizing autistic experience can be really unhelpful. One autistic profile is not the same as the next, and additional diagnoses add additional dimensions to the experience of the individual. For example, my autism favours predictability, routine, and solitude, while my ADHD can make me impulsive, disorganised, and really easily distracted. Neither cancels out the other, which affects both how I present to the outside world and what support and strategies I need to function at my best. I'll give you a brief example of how my profile might look in real life. So I can interact with people, pass as neurotypical at a single event, but it would take me days to recharge, and I would very often fail to follow up on any connections made because without the help of strategies, I forget people exist when I can't see them. I invite you to think for a moment on how this one aspect might impact me as a Christian leader. Having the option to not disclose and nobody will guess, managing a single event exceptionally well creates the impression that I am outgoing. needing to factor in sufficient time to decompress afterwards, having a contingency plan should there be another event imminently, which limits decompression time. The ADHD will mean that I say yes, even when I mean to say no. And the need to note down and diarise follow-up for any connections made immediately before they vanish out of my brain. And if there were too many to keep track of, needing to rehearse my apologies. And this is without any consideration for social communication or environmental stresses at the actual event itself. Now, church events are central to Christian leadership and part of church life. And whilst I love to be a part of them and can to a degree, my functionality does fluctuate. And even though you and I may be at the same event, I would not be having the same experience as a neurotypical leader, no matter how convincing I look. Hopefully this gives you a bit of an idea of the furious paddling that goes on beneath the surface of the water just to fulfill one fairly standard leadership responsibility. And needless to say, this isn't a sustainable model. So in the interest of avoiding burnout, I come to the question, what might an alternative look like? Training autistic Christian leaders, I think, is one key aspect. As a mother of two now adult neurodiverse sons, I've come to understand through their experiences the challenges that a lack of autistic leaders in children and youth ministry bring when it comes to supporting autistic youth to even entertain the possibility that Christian leadership is an option for them. We're probably all familiar with the importance of representation in role models. But even more so, I think autistic Christian leaders have a key part to play in creating leadership opportunities that value the traits of autistic people rather than focusing on what we are not. You might have heard the phrase, nothing about us without us, and having autistic voices contributing at every level of leadership training and ministry, I think is imperative to improving awareness and access for future autistic Christian leaders. How today's autistic Christian leaders experience their own training and are supported to minister in ways that reflect and embrace their difference, as opposed to framing autism as a deficit, will no doubt play a significant role in changing the narrative around autism in the church at every level and within every denomination, I hope. I first connected with the Centre for Autism and Theology, having taken the difficult decision to step away from Christian leadership, following a mismatch between who I am and the expectations I found were placed on me as a leader. I want to stress this wasn't malicious or deliberate on anyone's part, but simply a reflection of the stereotypes about autism that persist in all walks of life and consequently within the church, and a lack of opportunity to explore what being an autistic Christian leader meant for me and to me prior to my reaching the point of burnout. The rest of the leadership being neurotypical was certainly a barrier, and the additional burden of responsibility on me to explain autism generally, as well as explaining myself, proved to be unhealthy in terms of my own well-being, how it overshadowed my engagement in church life, and ultimately seems to cause more issues than it solved. I really resonated with what Susan said about what one says coming across as sometimes abrupt and rude, and even though that's not what's meant. So in stepping back from the leadership for the time being, I've had the opportunity to reflect on what I've learned and what I think might be helpful to support other Christian leaders or training leaders on the spectrum. And expectations, I think, are central to this conversation, which helpfully would apply to leaders whether they're autistic or not. Firstly, what are my expectations of myself? This can be a complex question and easily confused with what I think I need to be in order to get a seat at the table. But I found it helpful to frame within the context of my faith. If God is calling me to something, then I already have a seat. He's responsible for removing the obstacles, and he called me because he knows me, so it's important that I continue to be me. For example, I must frequently remind myself that God is not expecting me to be with people all the time. In fact, Jesus ministered to crowds, then he withdrew into solitude with God. Churches are good in that they don't rely on any one person, made up of many parts, which means I don't need to expect myself to be everything all the time to everyone. It's okay to be realistic and honest about what I can and can't do. This foundation of having acceptance and purpose in God and honesty with myself helped me in managing the expectations of others, although I am still developing in my communication of boundaries and my own needs without compulsively apologising throughout every conversation. Whether someone chooses to disclose or not doesn't mean their limitations are any less valid. And as a Christian leader, there are responsibilities and duties that we have. But if I can't do something, or if I need a reasonable adjustment to be able to fulfill a task, then it's important to be able to say so. Needless to say, much is dependent on a culture of open communication within training institutions and church hierarchy, and a moving away from the idea of what a leader should be. Jesus trained up 12 disciples. Each had different strengths, characters, and needs. So biblically, leaders need not be factory standard. Maybe I'll never be able to comfortably engage in small talk, but if I can recognise others around me that have this gift, encourage them and create a space for them to exercise it, that seems more biblical than depleting my energy, which God planned for me to invest in other aspects of leadership, in attempting to function beyond my God-given design. The Bible tells us that the parts of the body will take care of one another. If one part suffers, every part suffers, and if one part is honoured, every part shares its joy. As an autistic Christian leader, this verse has a special meaning for me, in putting forth the truth that difference is not outside the scope of God's plan for the church. And though we might not be where we need to be yet, I think reaching the point of even having these conversations is definitely a step closer.
Thank you, Hannah. Once again, we will pause just a minute to process. At this time, we'll hear from Ben. Ben?
Hello. So I must confess that I feel a little bit of an odd one out on the panel, because not only have I not been in Christian leadership, but I'm not currently in Christian leadership either. However, I am training to be a Christian leader, as I'm training for ordained ministry in the Church of England. So I can try and speak to my experience of what some of the challenges in training have been so far, and to some of the obstacles and opportunities that I can foresee as a Christian leader in the capacity of a parish priest and ultimately incumbent, hopefully. So I suppose my experience so far has been that of residential training in the Church of England. And I think one of the challenges with residential training, as I'm led to believe, as opposed to contextual training, is in the basis of communal formation. And so formation can, to become a Christian leader, can become a bit of almost a kind of cookie cutter process, where there's sort of one size fits all and you have to cover all bases and there's a lowest common denominator. And I guess that as someone with autism, I've found that kind of narrative around formation challenging, because although to a degree, being a parish priest in the Church of England, you have to be a jack of all trades and you have to care for the whole of the parish and all of its varying needs, spiritual, theological, pastoral, etc. There are still special and focused and narrow interests that I have that others in the church may not share. But they're not, obviously, there's not a huge amount of space allowed for them in training and formation in my experience so far. So that's what I'd say about that. And then go on to leadership potential in autistic individuals in the church. So what are the opportunities for autistic individuals in the realm of church leadership? So I think it's been discussed so far about the challenges of the church, and I think I share Hans von Balthasar's conviction that a person truly seeking Christ will tolerate the imperfections of the church. And that's been my experience. There's always frustrations there, but I think that the prize that we've got our eyes fixed on it in Christ makes them worth bearing. And so I think also that a lot of the problems that are tied up with accommodating autistic individuals in church leadership are human problems rather than being exclusively located within the church. So how can someone with autism, who is often defined by their focus and intensive interests in particular areas, be formed into someone who is also a jack of all trades parish priest, for example? Well, I don't think this has to be an insoluble problem, as I think that every parish priest has their own particular giftings, whether they be autistic or neurotypical. And that can be seen in, for example, the rise of the fivefold ministry survey, quiz online, where people can see whether they're particularly called to prophetic ministry or teaching ministry or evangelism, etc. And so we all acknowledge that we come with different gifts in the body of Christ and that we have our own particular foci and interests, but I think obviously the challenge is more acute for people with autism, and so obviously some examples of parish priests who also gone on to specialize in certain areas while not neglecting their kind of baseline priestly role would be someone like Father Alec Reid in Northern Ireland in the role of peace building and conflict transformation. That didn't detract from his base parish ministry, but he was a specialist in that area. So what within an autistic person might give them the potential to be a good leader? Well, I think autistic people are, in my experience, very good at producing rigorous and creative visions, and they're also good at structuring the detail in terms of their methodology and strategy and of how those visions are achieved. Furthermore, they can be very conscientious, diligent, precise, consistent, and hardworking. Now, I suppose one of the dangers here might be that they're too hardworking and so burn out, and that's been some of my experience, or lose their focus in other areas. Again, that's also been some of my experience. However, as we all know, those dangers are not just limited to autistic people, but are there for everybody. I suppose another challenge, which could be a benefit as well, is the greater propensity to solitude, as has been mentioned earlier, or one-on-one contact and meetings and things like that. So in my experience, I thrive better and can get more out of small groups or one-on-one exchanges or solitude than I can from a large group. And that can be challenging if you're in a large leadership team, etc. I think the parish that I'm hoping to go to for curacy, there's a leadership team of at least about 10 people. And so I'm currently focusing on how to put in place coping mechanisms and strategies to see how I can engage well and process the information effectively and develop a strategy for turn taking and doing things in a regular, routine way without detracting from others. I think another challenge could be that people with autism tend to have Socratic questioning minds, and so they tend to be quite sort of analytic and scrutinizing. That's certainly been my experience. And I think, as has been mentioned before, that can come across as arrogance or rudeness, and when that's not intended at all and that's not present. And I think that's an example of neurotypical people reading emotional intentions and motives into autistic people's behavior that just aren't really there. In biblical studies, we might call that eisegesis. And I think that the onus is then on neurotypical people to make the accommodation and the adjustment there. I think often one of the challenges in my placements that I've been on so far is my decisiveness and my decision making can come across as narrow-mindedness. So when I've thought about a subject, I will often think about it, in my experience, for more than the average person, certainly if it's a research type thing. And so then I've made my mind that A is the answer, and I'll declare that in what I see as quite, a humble way, but it will be taken as, because you have a clear and decisive answer, therefore you must be narrow-minded or arrogant. And so I think that's something that needs to be raised in terms of awareness of how autistic leaders might function. I think for me, the way in which I've navigated some of those challenges is whenever I've started, and this isn't a prescription to other people, but this is how I've come across in my experience. Whenever I've started on a placement or in a new housing situation or anything like that, I've always identified myself as having autism, and I've explained the particular ways in which that will impact on myself and on others, and how I come across, etc., etc. And I've said, you know, I'm always willing to have a chat about it. I'd be glad to, etc. Do let me know if you have any questions, yada yada yada. And that has been helpful for me, because then I think one of the challenges with autism in these contexts is that the awareness is quite low. It only affects about 1% of adults in England, for example. And so if you can take control of the agenda and say, yes, I have autism, here's how it affects me, feel free to enter into a dialogue on that, then you can, yeah, lead the agenda, and rather than people making incorrect assumptions that you might have the condition or how it might affect you. Yeah, and I suppose a final potential challenge, but also it's a double-edged sword really, would be the focus on detail and precision. I think that's a great advantage, and it can make sure that, you know, each detail of things is correct and is balanced, etc. But I think obviously the downside of that could be that people with autism might be more reluctant to delegate tasks to other people, and they might lose their focuses on the broader picture and the grand narrative, the vision, etc. I don't think they're insurmountable challenges or that they're just constrained to people with autism, but I think it's good to be aware of that potential challenge. Yeah, I think that's everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. We'll pause again just a minute before introducing the Q&A and going to break. All right, before we have our 5-minute break, I just want to give you a little bit of more in terms of what to expect for the Q&A. You can hopefully see on your screen a Q&A button that is run through Teams that will take you to the Q&A function. You can type in any question that you have on there, and once you submit it, it will seem to disappear into the ether. It doesn't disappear, it goes to the moderators to make sure that there isn't anything in your question that can't be made public, because again, this is recorded and will be posted on YouTube at a later date. So those questions will appear for those attendees if they are approved, and I'll direct those to one of our panelists. If you see a question in the Q&A function that you really like, you can give that question the thumbs up to sort of move it to the top of the queue. There's also a checkbox to submit your question anonymously. We will not say people's names out loud during the Q&A because, again, this is being recorded. But if you want that additional measure of anonymity, you can submit your questions anonymously. If your question is directed to a specific panelist, I will address it to that panelist. If not, I will try and call on a panelist that I think it makes the most sense to address your question to, with the knowledge that they may or may not have anything to add to that particular question. So at this time, we'll go ahead and take a 5-minute break. So please feel free to do whatever you need to do and come back here at 4:57 p.m. GMT, Aberdeen local time. All right, welcome back. At this time, we will begin the Q&A. I should have mentioned that we will wrap up promptly, which means we will take our final question at 5:25 p.m. So we have, at this point, about 27 minutes for questions. If we have a high volume of questions and can't get to them all, or if you just want to reach out and connect with other autistic people in church leadership positions, then as Léon said, there will be an email address at the end of the presentation that you can reach out to us at. But for the time being, we will go ahead and begin with our questions. We'll start with what would be the best advice you would give an autistic person going through minister training at the moment? Sue, since you have a fair bit of experience as an autistic leader, I wonder if you might be willing to give your thoughts.
Yes, could you repeat the question, Ian?
Absolutely. What would be the best advice you would give an autistic person going through minister training at the moment?
That is actually quite a difficult question, because when I began my ministerial training, which was part-time over 3 years, I didn't actually know that I was autistic at the time. And so, I mean, I don't know whether perhaps Ben would have a better take on this one, particularly as my experience of training was over 20 years ago, and you know, training has actually changed a lot since then. I mean, part of my work as a spiritual director is actually helping people discerning their vocation and you know, helping them as they move towards training. So I mean, I think that if I had an autistic person in that situation, then you know, I'd certainly be able to offer support from my experience. But I mean, I would personally say, you know, being as open and honest as possible about your needs right from the beginning would be important. And I mean, what actually was very helpful for me was that I was finding with assignments that sometimes I felt the notice was really quite short, and it was actually, I was doing it part-time, but because my mother was seriously ill at the time, I was able to ask for accommodations because I was needing to support her through her journey from cancer. But as I look back, I just realised that that was grace given to me, because it was actually helping support me in my autistic need as well, which I wasn't actually aware of. So, I mean, I don't know if Ben wants to add anything, but certainly kind of honesty. And I mean, I think one would have a personal tutor on the, you know, when one is training, and just really to get them on side, really, and to help them, you know, encourage them to advocate for you with the different members of staff, you know, to sort of make the training, and also the sensory aspects as well, I think could be quite important, particularly on residential aspects. So yes, that's as far as I can probably go on that one.
Would you like me to add something there, Ian? Yeah. Yeah.
By all means, please do.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, yeah, I very much agree with Sue. I think in terms of my training so far, people are very aware of my autism, partly because I gave a talk on it to ordinands, which was very well received. People asked quite a lot of questions, and people have been accepting of me in my autism. I think one of the challenges of formation and the way that it's currently understood, certainly in a residential context, is because in the Church of England scenario, you have ministry division, and ministry division says you need to tick these boxes which correspond to these criteria. And to be frank, not all of the boxes are precisely autistic friendly, you see what I mean? So kind of valuing things like valuing diversity of worship styles for their own sake, I might not be able to see the personal insular benefit to that. And so if I raise a question or challenge about that, it's kind of like, well, you need to go through that to be formed to tick the box. So that's been a kind of a frustration for me. I can understand why that's the way it is, because they've got to cover all bases and to tick all the boxes to get you signed off to get ordained as a priest. But yeah, I guess on the assignments and the more academic stuff, fortunately, because I was diagnosed with dyspraxia several years ago, I already had a lot of that academic support in place. It was more the kind of social and spirituality kind of styles, because I'm not really a very spiritual person. For me, kind of theology is prayer, and my spirituality is quite sort of academic, if you see what I mean, or cerebral. Yeah, so but with those kind of things, it's like, well, it's almost like sort of tough luck. You need to go through these hoops to get the prize at the end, and then you can run your own church and do things a bit differently, kind of thing. But I hope that helps.
Thank you, Sue and Ben both. For the next question, someone says, I find I'm not expecting a perfect church, but am finding the church intolerant. I find the way the church training process fixates on the cookie cutter model, which several of our panelists have highlighted, round pegs for round holes, is unfair and leads to rejection against autistic leaders. The system misses the point that my visual systems and making connections profile in conjunction with that I am a people's person. How do we convince the culture of autistic superpowers, or how do we convince people of all the things that autistic people can do well? Hannah and Chris, I wonder if you both might have insight into how we go about educating people about the things that autistic people and autistic individuals in particular can do well in church contexts. Hannah, would you like to answer first?
Yeah, sure. I was just thinking about, there's an anecdote, isn't there, about someone wanting to move the piano in a church, and the way to do that is to move it an inch at a time, because if you do a big change, everyone will say, no, the piano doesn't move. And that's what I was reminded of listening to that question, because I think, and this is something that frustrates me, but I think that it is incremental. I think some denominations, as we've heard today, have kind of paved the way in terms of their own systems and how they do things, which is really encouraging, but I think that definitely doesn't go across the board. So I would say being able to demonstrate what you can do, I have always found to be more helpful than trying to explain it, because you tend to kind of get caught up either in stereotyping or in justifying, and there can be some really kind of unhelpful conversations. So I've always found it most useful to just say, right, I'll do that, and then show them what I can do, and then review after the fact why how I am was useful there. But I would say it's, pray for patience, because that's what it takes. It really is one step at a time, and every time you as an individual autistic person does something well, that demonstrates that we do things well, and it just creates this bigger picture. So I think it's a collective effort, which is again why an autistic community like this is really, really important.
Thank you, Hannah. Relatedly, Chris, I wonder, you spoke during your presentation, Chris, about being about serving rather than being seen to serve. And I wonder if there might be, I recognize the humility in that statement, but I wonder if there might be a benefit as an autistic person in being seen to serve, in a sense, in light of what your example might show the church about what autistic individuals can do.
Yes, I take your point, Ian. I think what I was getting at is that certainly within the Catholic Church, and I'm assuming the same applies to the Church of England at local parish level, you get a small core of people who are involved in everything. They're the ones who serve Mass, arrange the flowers, Eucharistic minister. They're the ones who are the readers. They're involved in everything. And that's what I mean by being seen to be serving. They're up there almost as if they're saying, I'm here, look at me. Whereas what I'm interested in serving, being a servant leader. As you're quite right to say, Ian, it's about humanity. How to teach others about autism and neurodiversity. Well, for the past few years, I lecture seminary students at Oscott around disability issues, and I've included in my session autism and how autistic leaders can be seen within the church.
Thank you, Chris. Sue, you might have something to add to this.
Yes, indirectly. One thing I found out rather too late to help me when I was going through a difficult time was that I think most dioceses in the Church of England actually have a disability advisor. And, you know, one thing that I found really important for myself anyway is, you know, as we've recently appointed someone in our diocese, is to actually, you know, offer myself to, you know, just support, be part of the team in the area of raising awareness. And I think that, you know, kind of as Hannah was saying, it's just sort of step by step. It's like a drip, drip, drip approach. But, you know, just beginning to offer training at grassroots level. I mean, hopefully, you know, the message will get through. I mean, the very first training I did, there was a male curate who was present, and you know, his response was actually amazing. You know, he said that, you know, he, as a result of, you know, the teaching that we as a little group were giving, said that, you know, he no longer saw autistic people as objects to be pitted. And, you know, I just felt, you know, that was huge. And, you know, I think, you know, just sort of to change one person's attitude, it's really worthwhile.
Amen. For our next question, someone asks, what would you say, or what do you say to people in the church who dismiss accommodations because they are simply traits you need to grow into? For example, a ministry supervisor has dismissed my requests for more information because I need to grow in being flexible and letting go of control. I suspect many of us might have experience with this particular phenomena, but Hannah, I wonder if you might have some insight.
I was just thinking that I would have to send up a really quick prayer for grace if that was happening to me. But it is, yeah, it is all too common. There's no perfect church trope is a kind of catch-all for anything that might involve a change other people don't necessarily want to make. So I would be encouraged that you're not on your own with it. But how to navigate is, again, back to education and persistence and explaining the difference between why I am asking for more information and trying to control things, because that's not the same thing. It's not even the same language. So I would quite analytically pick it apart to explain why it was that actually we were talking at cross purposes. Again, this might not be very helpful in terms of how you're kind of perceived for problem solving and being rude and abrupt and things like this, but that would be how I would handle it, is to make time to speak to the person and, as tactfully as I possibly could, explain why what I was asking was a need rather than something that I was going to grow out of or just a trait.
And Ben, what are your thoughts?
So I was just going to say, yeah, I think my main experience of this has been in preaching, and I think it's not a simple zero-sum game, in the sense that I don't know. I think sometimes it's been easy for me to be tempted to say, okay, I don't really need to listen to some of the feedback from my supervisor because I am more challenged in, ways of expressing myself visually and hand gestures and things like that, to more effectively communicate. And obviously, in an ideal world, we'd be able to preach from the radio or via written discourses, etc. But I guess some of the best supervisors that I've had on some of my placements are people that understand that these things are challenges for me and don't want to sort of start my whole kind of preaching education from scratch, but want to tweak at the edges to try and get at the things that are challenging. But some of the more difficult supervisors I've had want to try and change my preaching style to make it kind of less cerebral and less detailed and things like that, and I found that more challenging, whereas I've been more willing to sort of say, okay, I'll adjust how much direct eye contact I give different parts of the room, and how much I use my hands for gestures, and different pitch variations, etc. And so, yeah, I think it's about being able to be as flexible as possible whilst not compromising on the substance of the unique contribution you have to make. Yeah, that's been my experience in the area of preaching anyway.
Thank you. Our next question I'll ask Sue. This is from someone who has been an ordained pastor for 20 years and was just diagnosed with autism 7 years ago. At this point, they haven't formally revealed their diagnosis to their congregation, although they've spoken about it openly in other contexts. And their reluctance is based on the stereotype that autistics can't be emotionally available and lack empathy. So the fear is that that would put up a barrier to those who would normally seek them out for pastoral care. Sue, do you have any advice that you would give to those who have been, quote unquote, in the closet with their diagnosis while in established ministry?
Yes, are you saying that this person had been in ministry for a number of years prior to being diagnosed?
Correct, and has not shared that.
So that means then that as an undiagnosed person, they would have had a relationship with their congregation, and their congregation, would have experienced, their pastoral and other qualities. And of course, being diagnosed with autism, doesn't sort of change that in any way. And I mean, certainly from my own experience, certainly other leaders in the church know of my diagnosis, and I have shared, when I tell people in the congregation, I wouldn't sort of stand up at the front and kind of tell everyone in a sort of blanket way. I might just sort of tell people on a need to know basis in conversation, where I feel that it's not only getting it off my chest, but maybe in a way just kind of facilitating our relationship. For example, in my spiritual direction ministry, I've been a spiritual director now for about 18 years, and most people don't know in that relationship about my autism. One or two do, and I think that in that sort of situation, people know that I can empathise. Maybe I do that in a different way. And so I think that, the more people get to know you as a person and can see that, we are empathetic, the diagnosis shouldn't actually affect the way they see us or the way they approach us. Certainly, people who know about my autism in the church will still value my pastoral support, and it hasn't made any difference. I don't think it stopped people coming, if that helps.
Thank you, Sue. We also have someone who was diagnosed autistic 4 years ago and has really enjoyed today, and says that they live their life like a chameleon, constantly trying to see how to blend in with new groups of people, and how tiring it is being different people. Chris, do you have any advice to give to someone sort of feeling the strain of adapting to different groups?
Not really, no. But what might work for me might not work for somebody else.
That's quite fair.
Yeah, because for me, I like to take 5-10 minutes between groups. So I'm not going straight from one to the other. Preferably with a cup of coffee. But that's my personal choice. Might not work for everybody.
Thank you, Chris. Ben, we have someone asking, you talked about putting in place different coping strategies for when you will do your curacy. In what ways has your college supported or not supported you during this? Or in what ways do they support you or not support you?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned about, so there's a disability advisor at college. To be totally honest, I haven't needed to seek their support a huge amount, because I already had a lot of the dyspraxia measures carried over, because I had a prior diagnosis of dyspraxia and I'm quite used to academic theology. So the studies side, I think often the support is often focused on the academic studies side, when for me, I think the greater and more intangible and entrenched challenges are the social ones and the spiritual ones. And so I guess I haven't specifically asked staff members, can I opt out of this, or could I have a reasonable adjustment made on that, because I know that they're formation requirements. So I think the rhetoric and the kind of categorization of things into tick boxes for formation means that it's harder to be flexible and to request reasonable adjustments if you want to end up being signed off, if you see what I mean. I think some of it is a kind of a waiting game until you can enter into the leadership role, so that then you can, because you're more sort of calling the shots, you can adjust how things are done so that they're more comfortable for you. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. I know it's quite generalized, but yeah.
Yes, thank you. And we're almost out of time, but we've got time for maybe a couple more questions. The next one, Sue, you might have some insight into this. Someone says, in the Church of England, those who feel called to ordained ministry who are visually or hearing impaired are offered specialist support from day one. I feel strongly that this should be the case with autistic people too. How can I challenge this, and to whom should I take this question?
If your diocese has a disability advisor, I think that he or she would be a good person to speak to. And I suppose one's bishop as well would be a good person to speak to. I think that's very important. And I mean, one thing we haven't looked at, and I was kind of thinking about it when other people were talking about accommodations and maybe the reluctance church leaders have to put them in place for us, is at what point do we quote the Equality Act, which is something that is very much on our side, and I think that a lot of churches aren't actually aware of, particularly in relation to autism. Maybe they are in relation to some other more visible disabilities. But yes, no, I agree that that's hugely important, that, you know, we should be, and I think, you know, when I'm giving teaching to church leaders, I think that, you know, if an autistic person or member of staff joins a congregation, then the leadership should actually be proactive in asking them what they need and not leave it to the autistic person, who may be feeling a little bit nervous, to actually, begin the conversation. I think that, it's really important for leaders to be proactive and just, ask people what accommodations they would find helpful, to help them function at their best in whatever role they've been appointed to. If that helps. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. A question for Hannah. Someone says, it seems like autistic empathy means that autistic people are particularly suited to pastoral ministry, but does the deep empathy also lead too easily to burnout? And what are good ways to manage overwhelming empathic or empathetic feelings in ministry? Hannah, you talked about burnout in your own ministry. I wonder if you might have some thoughts about preventing empathy-related burnout.
Yeah, great question, and something that is very close to my heart. I don't know that it's necessarily true of all autistic people, what levels their empathy are at, but I do know that, in my own circle, it's very, very common to have just an overwhelming amount of empathy, and that does lend itself to amazing pastoral care and supportive roles, but it's a real balancing act, I've certainly found, to be able to function within this role and keep myself safe. I would say there's two strands to my own approach, which again, as Chris has already said, it might not work for you, but I'll put it out there. So one strand is about my relationship with God. It's my vertical relationship. I did, before accepting my first ministry position, I did it was about a 6-month hyper-focused study on what it meant to abide in Christ, because it was really, really important to me that I understood biblically and spiritually, and that had settled in me what that looked like, and receiving from God and making sure that he's, pouring into me. So that was one thing. The other thing I think, which kind of tied in with that, is honesty with yourself, with being able to prioritize yourself, which is an uncomfortable thing in Christian communities because it quite often gets read as selfishness and, you're here to serve and these things. But God loves you as much as he loves the people that you're serving. Simple as that for me. And I think there's something about being able to be honest with yourself about what you need, and your strategies for self-care might look different to my strategies. For me, there's a combination of spiritual practices, physical things, because I have to be moving, and creative, free-flowing things, things that are gonna enable me to process stuff that I might not be able to put into words, which can be the thing with deep empathy, is it can be really, really hard to express. I feel everything under my skin, and you can't say that because it doesn't make sense. So I think finding ways to kind of, I suppose, emotionally cleanse yourself and keeping close to God while you're doing anything that you're doing, because that's ultimately where the resource comes from, would be, my advice.
All right, I believe we probably need to move on. I will say we're just about out of time, and I want to read one last item that is not a question, but is the most liked item in the Q&A, which is someone saying, no question, but I wanted to thank the panelists for their affirming neurodiversity theology. It's much needed in churches and academic theology alike, and a breath of God-breathed fresh air. I want to echo that sentiment and thank you all for being a part of this. With that, I will hand it over to Léon to close us out. Léon?
Thank you so much, Ian. And yes, that last comment, that really sums up what I'm feeling. It's really humbling as well to listen to all your experiences. And I do hope that there is a lot of non-autistic church leaders listening to this webinar, because there was so much, it was so rich what you were all saying, and it's so important for the church to listen to this. And I just want to thank you all. But before I do that formally, Ian, you've done a wonderful job moderating this discussion, but part of me felt like, yeah, but I'm really curious to hear Ian, because he is a parish priest, he is in ministry. Can you say a little bit what you heard today, how did that resonate with your experiences, maybe just briefly before we close this session?
Sure. I'll say there were certainly some familiar notes struck by all of the panelists. I think we all share some common experiences. I particularly liked Sue's highlighting of the need to set clear expectations and have clear expectations. That is tremendously helpful in ministry. I echo Chris's sentiments about being sort of drawn more to the contemplative side of things at times. That is certainly an aspect of ministry that drew me in initially. I think Hannah spoke brilliantly to the challenges that are involved in church leadership as an autistic person, and I think that we have a lot of significant work to do in that regard as a church in terms of removing some of those obstacles and making this a healthier place for autistic people to lead. And I think Ben did a great job in highlighting the sort of ways in which many autistic traits, while not universal, can be both a challenge and a blessing to ministry. And I think that that's something important for us to highlight, and something that I try to do. I am in many ways, a priest because I'm autistic, because this is a special interest of mine, right? And an autistic special interest, which is a very, very unique thing. And so I wouldn't be who I am or the priest that I am without being autistic. So that's my brief thoughts and experience.
Thank you so much, and I really like what you just said. I wouldn't be a priest without who I am, and I think that's the lesson to learn, I think, from this webinar, or at least one of the many lessons to learn, perhaps. Ian, thank you once more for moderating this webinar in such a gentle and good way. It was really a pleasure. Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much for sharing everything that you shared. The same for you, Sue, Hannah, and Chris. I'm deeply grateful that you wanted to speak out and that you want to speak out to the church, to whoever is listening, because there's so much that we need to listen to. So I also want to thank you, everyone who attended this webinar. There was a high turnout, and that just shows how much this question is, and this topic is really alive. Thank you for joining us, and I wish you all a very happy Christmas. And the last thing to do is to repeat what I said in the beginning. Again, with the Center for Autism and Theology, we are forming a group of autistic ministers or ordinands or other people who have some kind of church leadership, formal, informal, lay, ordained. If you identify as autistic and in some kind of ministry and you want to get in touch with this group, don't hesitate to email us. The email address, that's the word, the email address is cat@abdn.ac.uk, and it will appear on the screen in a couple of seconds. So thank you all, and I wish you very well. Thank you.